Before the Allied forces liberated the Nazi concentration camps, they had heard a couple of stories of the atrocities committed by the Nazis in these camps. But, as they began to liberate the camps in July 1944, what they saw with their eyes was nothing compared to what they had heard. Some of the soldiers were filled with blinding rage, while others felt a deep sense of helplessness as a result of the image which will never be erased from their minds. From thousands of rotting corpses piled on top of each other and barely alive survivors, here are the horrific images seen by the Allied forces as they liberated the Nazi concentration camps.
Welcome to the Unveiled History.
By mid-1944, it became clear to the Nazis that they were on the losing end of the war. From the east, the Soviet army was marching down towards Berlin, killing every Nazi on its path, and, in the west, the Allied forces had successfully won the war in Normandy, and they too were also advancing towards Germany. Afraid of what might happen if the Allied forces discovered the atrocities in the concentration camps, Heinrich Himmler, in charge of the organisation of the camps, ordered his men to destroy traces of the atrocities. So, the SS began to evacuate most of the prisoners from the front and deep into Germany. One such camp where this evacuation took place was Majdanek, located in Lublin, Poland, established in July 1941 on the orders of Heinrich Himmler. Majdanek was originally created to serve as a labour camp, but within a year, Majdanek had been converted into an extermination camp, where prisoners too weak to work were killed. From the autumn of 1942 to the autumn of 1943, Jewish prisoners were killed with Zyklon B and carbon monoxide in gas chambers. Out of more than 2 million Jews killed in the course of the war, it is estimated that about 60,000 were killed in Majdanek. As the Soviet army approached Majdanek in July 1944, the camp personnel remaining at the camp hastily abandoned the camp, without fully dismantling it. So, when the Soviet army arrived at Majdanek on the night of July 22nd, they were able to capture the camp virtually intact. Although prisoners were evacuated from the camp, the Soviet army still found thousands of inmates, mainly Soviet prisoners of war. They also found substantial evidence of the atrocities committed by the Nazis in the camp. There were ashes, bones, human remains, and the bodies of the murdered prisoners, mainly Jews and Poles. The horrors experienced by the prisoners of Majdanek were further emphasized by the surviving traces of the crime, including gas chambers, crematoriums, prisoners' barracks, and hundreds of thousands of shoes. 1 month after the camp's takeover, the Soviets set up a special Polish-Soviet commission to investigate and document the crimes committed at Majdanek. An initiative was also launched to establish a museum at the site of the camp, and in July 1947, the Polish government passed a law giving the Majdanek State Museum its legal status. 6 months after the liberation of Majdanek, the Red Army made their way to Auschwitz, the most notorious centre of the Nazi horrific crimes. But before they arrived at the camp, Auschwitz camp personnel forced the majority of the prisoners to march westward in what would become known as death marches. The prisoners were forced to march hundreds of miles in freezing weather without proper clothing and in some cases, no shoes. Over the course of the death marches, which lasted for weeks, tens of thousands of prisoners died from the cold or hunger, while others were shot because they couldn't keep up. But even before the death marches began, thousands of prisoners had been killed. Auschwitz-Birkenau, a sub-camp in Auschwitz, was the killing centre. All the deported prisoners from other camps, including Majdanek, were immediately sent to the gas chambers once they arrived. On July 27, 1945, the Soviet troops finally arrived at Auschwitz and liberated the camp. They were greeted by 7,000 emaciated prisoners, some already at death's door. Although the camp was liberated, it is important to add that the liberation of Auschwitz was not a specific goal of the Red Army. It was simply a consequence of their advance westward towards Poland. Of the 7,000 prisoners left behind at Auschwitz, the majority of them are middle-aged adults or children younger than 15. Just like at Majdanek, the Soviets found ample evidence of the horrific crimes committed by the Nazis. The Nazis had destroyed most of the warehouses and buildings before they left, but the soldiers still found some personal belongings of the victims. There were about 600 corpses, 370,000 men's suits, 837 articles of women's clothing, and 7 tons of human hair. The hair had been shaved from the heads of women who had died in the gas chambers. The troops also found piles of ash that had once been human bodies, prisoners living in barracks that were encrusted with excrement, and emaciated patients who became ill when they ate the food they were offered. Battle-hardened Russian soldiers who were used to seeing death on the battlefield were shocked by the evidence of the Nazi crimes. They could not comprehend the scale of atrocities that had occurred in the camp, and many of them broke down in tears. Red Army General Vasily Petrenko, commander of the 107th Infantry Division, remarked, "I who saw people dying every day was shocked by the Nazis' indescribable hatred towards the inmates who had turned into living skeletons. I read about the Nazis' treatment of Jews in various leaflets, but there was nothing about the Nazis' treatment of women, children, and old men. It was Auschwitz that I found out about the fate of the Jews." Assisted by the Polish Red Cross, the Liberating Force tried to help the survivors by organising medical care and food. As of late June 1945, there were still about 300 survivors who were too weak to be moved. Auschwitz had the largest population of prisoners. According to estimates, about 1.3 million prisoners were sent to Auschwitz, but only 7,000 remained when the Soviets arrived. When the men of the 42nd Rainbow Division stepped into the town of Dachau in April 1945, they expected to find an abandoned training facility or at worst a prisoner of war camp. News of the other camps that had been liberated by the Soviets had reached them, but what they saw was nothing compared to what they had heard. What they saw would forever be seared into their memories for as long as they lived. The first thing that greeted the soldiers was the smell, which some thought was from a chemical factory. But they were wrong. The smell was from the piles of dead bodies in railroad cars in different states of decomposition. Weeks earlier, before the American soldiers arrived, the Nazi commander of Buchenwald, another concentration camp, had packed about 3,000 prisoners into 40 train cars to hide them from the approaching Allied forces. The train, which was supposed to arrive in Dachau a few days later, ended up spending 3 weeks getting to Dachau. Of the 3,000 prisoners on the train, only about a quarter survived. The rest died from starvation, dehydration, asphyxiation, and disease. And they were left to rot on the railway cars. The sight and smell of the dead bodies left the American soldiers physically ill and emotionally shocked. But it was only a taste of what they found inside the camp. Inside Dachau, the soldiers found more dead bodies, piles and piles of naked corpses with signs of malnourishment. The survivors of the camp were no better, numbered around 32,000. The survivors looked like walking skeletons. Some of them were ridden with typhus and lice. Upon seeing these conditions, some of the soldiers broke down in tears. But others seethed with hot rage so much that when 4 German officers emerged from the woods holding up a white handkerchief, they were immediately shot dead. Word of what happened at Dachau spread like wildfire, and many soldiers came to the concentration camps in the days and weeks following the liberation to bear witness to the Nazi atrocities. Unlike Auschwitz and Dachau, which were considered death camps, the Nazi camp in Bergen-Belsen was not. Nevertheless, the conditions in the camp were horrific. Bergen-Belsen was designed to hold around 10,000 people. But as the Allied forces advanced further and further into Europe, tens of thousands of prisoners were sent to Bergen-Belsen. This resulted in overcrowding. The deliberate maltreatment, starvation and malnourishment of prisoners, together with overcrowding, led to the rapid spread of diseases such as typhus and typhoid. In April 1945, 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment and the 11th Armoured Division of the British Army arrived at Bergen-Belsen. Like the other soldiers, they were unprepared for what they saw. One of the first British soldiers to enter the camp, Major Leonard Burney, recalled, "I remember being completely shattered." Inside the camp were about 55,000 prisoners, many of whom were emaciated and sick. There were thousands of dead bodies lying on the streets and in open mass graves. The soldiers were not adequately prepared to handle the situation. As a result, about 14,000 people died even after they were liberated. Their lives were lost to the diseases that ravaged the camp. Decades later, some of the soldiers continued to recall the horrific scenes they had seen at the camps. Seeing the camps had given them a new meaning to the war. They were not just fighting an enemy, they were fighting evil itself.